Anyway, there were some great memories, but there was right after Paris was, quote, liberated by our troops.
Was that a party?
Well, that was a party. Now, you got to realize we took them back from the Germans, so to speak.
Yeah, the cabaret time.
The cabaret time. So the U.S. Army, being what it was, decided to be very, very understanding and liberal, and they issued an order that any one of the GIs wanting to go to the high holy services, those of the Jewish faith, there were trucks going into Paris, and you were welcome to join us, you know. Okay, great. Now, there is a synagogue in Paris, which you've probably heard of, the Rothschild Synagogue,
Yep.
which I believe can house about 2,000 people at one time. Now, the roof had been blown off that during some of the air attacks, and they had kind of rebuilt it, or they patched it up anyway. They patched it up enough so that they go ahead and hold services again, which was quite the thing. Now, I hadn't been to synagogue in a while because, you know, circumstance. Anyway, the opportunity lent itself to go to the Rothschild Synagogue. I says, by all means. I had a buddy of mine by the name of McAvoy. I'll never forget him, Mac. He was one of the company cooks. Typical Irish humor, man. He was sharp. No matter what you said, he had a comment. I'll give you an idea of what he said. One of Patton's right-hand men, some full colonel, came around and pulled a quick inspection of the kitchen. I was on KP at the time. And he comes into the kitchen, and as he passed me by, the colonel says to me, "Hey, you." He says, "Who's McAvoy?" I said, "McAvoy?" I says, "That's him, sir, right there, Sergeant." He goes over to McAvoy. He says, "I hear you're quite a cook." And Mac says to him, "Yes, sir, I think I am." He says, "You know how to make a kidney stew?" He says, "Yes, sir, you boil the piss out of it." Now, picture, if you will, man. I took, Mac and I became buddies over, you know. So when I heard that I could go into Paris for services, I says, "Hey, Mac, today you become Jewish. You take a ride with us. Come on, we get you into Paris, right?" I says, "You can even come to services with me." He says, "You're kidding." He says, "I'm Irish Catholic." I says, "A big deal." I says, "You didn't get hit by any of the German bombs. You think God's going to strike you dead for walking in a synagogue?" I says, "Think again." I says, "We invented Jesus, remember?" So he laughed about that. He says, "Yeah, well," he says, "I'll meet you outside." Okay. So after in the synagogue, I must have been one of about, if there were 100 GIs in there, it was a lot.
Were there other Jews there?
There were other Jews there. These same Jews, believe it or not, Ben, were hidden by the local French gentry who happened to like them enough to save them from the Nazis, from the Germans. So the survivors came to services, which was something to see.
Must have been pretty emotional.
It was quite emotional,
Yeah.
oh yeah. And I remember this one French Jewish man sitting next to me, and he kept looking at me, and I kept looking at him, and we had, of course, a kinship being Jewish. And then he spoke French, of course, and my French was pretty good. My high school French was pretty good. And then as we talked, then he says to me in Yiddish, he says, "Do you speak Yiddish?" And I says, "Yes, of course." So now we reversed it. We went into full-blown Yiddish, you know, and it sounded like being back in New York on 14th Street if it happened, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, we hit it off quite well, and of course he had a daughter he wanted me to meet. Nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn, after all. So we're outside, services were ended, and we're outside the synagogue, and we're on the stoop, on the stairways going out. And of course McAvoy, faithful old buddy, is outside waiting for me. And he hears me speaking Yiddish and French to this Frenchman, but he understood some of the French, but he didn't understand the Yiddish. But in his mind, I'm speaking French. Get it?
Mm-hmm.
So when I parted with this French gentleman, I get to Mac. I says, "Okay, Mac." He says, "You know, Pac," he says, "it amazes me no end." He says, "How fluent you are in French." He says, "You're a real interpreter." For 3 months, I had to beat the company against the wall. I said, "I am not an interpreter. I'm speaking Yiddish."
You could have had a new job if you were, right?
That was so funny. It was a riot. It was just a riot.